Hi, I'm Paul Young, a partner in the firm of Youngmar Malice and Associates. Welcome to the Paul Squared podcast. I've been helping clients file for bankruptcy relief and Social Security claims since 1986. I created this podcast to provide an overview of the bankruptcy and Social Security disability process and hopefully answer the most frequently asked questions. My goal is to help clients regain financial stability and support them through the challenging times of either being unable to work or pay their bills due to a disability. While this podcast serves to provide some general guidelines around the practice areas we discuss, you should always consult directly with an attorney to make sure the specifics of your particular situation match up with the various laws within those areas. The decision of choosing an attorney is an important one, and you should give it careful thought before deciding. If you need representation or just have any questions, please feel free to contact me at 215 639 5297 or visit our website at www.youngmarlaw.com. That's YOUNGMARRLAW.com. That's youngmarlaw.com. Thank you.
Today, we're back with Paul Young, and we're going to discuss Social Security disability, Social Security disability insurance, sometimes it's called, another practice area that Paul operates within. So welcome back, Paul.
Hi, Pete. Nice to be here.
Well, we spent the first three episodes giving a background to yourself and discussing bankruptcy-related questions and issues as it relates to bankruptcy practice. But one of the things that you had mentioned in our initial episode, where you described your background and your experiences with your father, was disability practice, and how you help people who file disability claims through Social Security administration and things like that. So one of the things we wanted to talk to today in this episode was to answer some of the general questions that people come to you with as it relates to whether they qualify for Social Security disability, what that means, what's the process, and so forth. So I guess to start it all off, what does SSD and SSDI stand for? I think I may have just given it away in what I described, but just to make sure that we're clear with it, because that's how these acronyms are often put out there. What do those two stand for?
Well, there's actually there's also one I would add, Pete. There's SSD, with Social Security Disability Insurance benefits, which is what most people consider for SSD, which is Social Security Disability. But there's also SSI, which is Supplemental Security Income Benefits, and that's also based on being disabled. But generally, that's for people who don't have the requisite what's called work credits, and I can explain that further. But those are the two general programs. There's other sub programs within that, but those are the general disability programs.
And so we're talking about disability, and obviously with Social Security, they're administered through the government. What are these programs in place for? Can you give us a general overview of what's here?
Sure. I can. The general definition of disability is it's really a program that it's not a temporary situation. It's not something for someone who I was injured and I'm going to be out 2 or 3 months. It's an injury or illness that's likely to prevent a person from any gainful employment for a continuous or sustained basis for a minimum of 1 year. So it could be a lifetime, which in most cases, people who are applying aren't necessarily applying for a defined period. But it can be a defined period as long as that defined period is more than 1 year.
So qualifications are you have to be disabled, and you have to be disabled for a period of a year or longer.
Well, or expect it to be. So you don't have to necessarily have been out that year by the time you apply, but you have to have an injury or illness that's going to disable you for a minimum of a 1 year period.
So what is the definition of disability as used in this context?
Well, that's an interesting question, Pete. It really is something where it depends on some other factors, including your age, and your requisite work experience. So, for example, the definition of disability or someone meeting the definition of disability at 35 isn't the same as somebody meeting it at 60. So it changes a little bit based upon your age.
But is it driven around the concept that this disability that you're looking at is interfering with your ability to work?
Yes, it's still generally it would be your inability to perform gainful employment on a regular and sustained basis. So
Okay.
that would be it's just that at an older age, Social Security looks at it like you have less transferable skills to
Right.
other occupations than you would at a younger age.
So there could be a lot of factors that go into defining whether someone is disabled and whether they can perform meaningful work or not. But in general, this is a program that's out there for people who through some event, whether we'll talk about some of the reasons why people may qualify as being considered disabled, but the government saying, hey, for a long enough period of time, 1 year or longer, or anticipated 1 year or longer, we think something about your situation means you're not going to have gainful employment and we need to supplement your income through this program.
Correct.
Is that fair? Okay.
Yes, it is.
Do you, from your knowledge, have an idea of how many people who file for SSD or SSI actually get it? Is it hard to get? Is it a difficult process? I mean, can you just talk a little bit about what it means to go through this?
Sure, sure. The process, first of all, I would say to you from doing it, like I said, 38 years, the process has definitely gotten more difficult. Statistically, less people are approved than they were 30 years ago. The process is it's fairly cumbersome. It can be burdensome. There's a lot of paperwork. It starts with an initial application. If you're denied on the initial application, you can request reconsideration, which is the next step. If you're denied again on reconsideration, you would request a hearing, and then ultimately you could appear in front of it's called an administrative law judge at a hearing. And then if you're still denied, there's appeal processes past that. There's what's called the appeals counsel, which is the next step after the hearing, and then finally the federal court if you decided to take it that far.
So are you finding, is it you've been your experience? You just said this, the process seems to have gotten more difficult in the more recent years. Are people having to take more of those potential steps to maybe ultimately get eligible for the disability benefits?
Yeah, I would say not only are they taking, is it so much that it ends up taking more steps. I think there's actually less people approved.
Okay.
I think it
It's just
takes
the criteria.
I think it takes a greater level of impairment to qualify someone, and the proving that impairment has become more difficult than it was, in my opinion, 20 years ago, let's say.
So when we're talking impairments, I know one of the things just from discussing this with you previously that there are certain diseases or disabilities that put you at a higher probability, or at least it's it just by someone telling you they have one of these things that you say, hey, there's a better chance that you may meet the impairment credibility or criteria for this program. Can you talk about what some of the common diseases or disabilities you see that are more likely to get someone eligible?
Sure, sure. First of all, there's something called listed impairments. That's when somebody meets whatever it might be, whether it's a cardiac, there's a bunch in every, it could be even orthopedic, it could be mental health. If the Social Security Administration feels that it's so severe on its face that it's called listed impairments, where they actually define what that would be. So, for example, pulmonary, there's breathing test results that if they're so severe, you automatically get it.
Okay.
Those aren't most of the people that I'm meeting with, because those people are the ones that may be getting it without even the need of an attorney. But
But can I
beyond that,
stop you there for one
sure,
second?
sure,
So
please.
if someone's getting it without the need of an attorney, how would they do it? That they just filed themselves
They
or
just,
that
I mean, it's sometimes we're still assisting and they get it by meeting a listed impairment. That the listed impairments, I would say, probably only equal 10% of the people who get benefits. So
okay,
an example might be when somebody has kidney disease and they're on dialysis already, or God forbid, ALS, something so significant. The great majority of people are more in the gray areas where, like
right,
you were asking me the types of conditions. It could be orthopedic, it could be mental health, um, so many different disorders. As I've mentioned before to other people when I'm speaking to them about disability, it isn't necessarily the title. It's the significance as it impacts your work ability. Is it work preclusive? So,
right,
and then you're factoring in as well the age of the person. So, and their work history. So someone who, for example, is 57 years old and say was a manual laborer, maybe they were stone worker or they were roofer. If they have significant back issues, they've had maybe 2 lumbar fusions, they're going to be more likely to get disability than that same person who's 37, because the
right.
way the system is set up, that there's a implicate there's a or um, there's an inference that there's less transferability from an older person to a job that would be more sedentary than a younger person.
And I would assume the same is true that the 57-year-old with diffused lumbar or vertebrae who has a desk job may be less likely to get it than the roofer who's got to climb
Correct.
up and down ladders all day.
That's exactly correct.
Right. And so really it sounds like, unless you fit in one of these small categories of people where it's a very obvious and severe injury where, you're going to get it, most of your time is spent in helping guide people who are more on the gray areas and the fringes
Yes.
of do they qualify or not, and you have to put together all the evidence to help support that they are in fact disabled.
Yes. Part of the process is absolutely guiding them as to what is oftentimes I'll speak with people who have multiple impairments, and what they might consider significant for disability purposes aren't necessarily what I know are going to prove to be quite as work preclusive. And they might have other problems that are significant for purposes of work preclusivity, and they might not have really even thought of that as the disabling element. And I help them parse through it, and then also help them and guide them with treatment options to suggest, hey, you really haven't seen someone quite a while, but you're complaining you still have migraine headaches 3 times a week. Probably a good idea to see a neurologist so we can help document that despite treatment, it's still creating this issue.
Right. And so it sounds like it's a somewhat complex analysis of saying, look, I need to know your age. I need to know your occupation. I need to know, are you able to do other types of jobs that this impairment wouldn't prevent you from having gainful employment? How, again, how old are you? All those types of things that, unless you're in that group of clear and obvious impairment type of issues, the analysis piece is really what you're helping guide people through as to whether or not they're going to fit into this program or not.
Absolutely. And the other part of this, which is I think is extremely important, is there's people who call or that I speak to regularly who will just want to know, hey, I'm really struggling. I don't know whether, do you think I'm really a candidate for
Right.
disability? So part of it is, are they going to be, because it's a process. It might take a year and a half to get the benefits. Financially, it's a real struggle. And they
Right.
want to know, do you really think before I go through this that I really have a real chance? And
Right.
part of it is that piece as well.
Giving them the your years of experience of saying, I think you have a chance here or not.
Yeah, I think even though we can't guarantee any results, I
Right.
think you're actually a real candidate. Now, it's a shame because there are people that I speak to every week where they're absolutely real candidates for getting benefits, but financially they just say, "Hey, I can't stop working.
Right.
It might kill me, but I can't stop working."
Right.
And that's the unfortunate reality for some people.
And I think you mentioned this already, but does a condition have to be physical for you to qualify for Social Security disability?
No, no, there's I would say probably at least I would say maybe 50% of all claims um, are based upon mental health conditions or some other non-exertional as well. So most most of the non-exertional are, for example, a mental health condition, but there's such a wide variance even within, obviously, that and what makes it a little bit challenging is there you're largely dependent upon treatment as well because it's not you can't have an MRI reading that's going to
Right.
necessarily tell if someone suffers with schizophrenia or suffers with severe bipolar disorder or schizoaffective or personality disorder. It's treatment.
Right.
So you have to assess as a practitioner, is there enough going to be enough treatment history to help substantiate some of this?
And I guess in sort of conjunction with that is, it's very doctor driven, I would imagine, that you're getting a medical professional is backing you up on saying this is a real problem here.
Yeah, unfortunately, part of this whole process for what I say unfortunately for claimants is that unfortunately they're going to need the cooperation. Some doctors, this is the unfortunate part, just don't want to get involved.
Yeah.
They just say it's not my policy. I don't, and yet Social Security, and especially if it reaches a hearing level, they want to see a doctor's opinion, especially when it's something that they can't quantify with an MRI.
Right.
So we really do at some point generally need the cooperation in a mental health case, for example, of the psychiatrist, of the psychologist to suggest, hey, these complaints, this person suffers with severe panic disorder, they'd have difficulty going out regularly, they're agoraphobic, they can't go out of their house frequently, different things like that, but it needs to be substantiated. And that's where that becomes part of the challenge.
So you can have a situation where someone's suffering from a mental health issue. In your opinion, they're disabled, but without the support of the treating physician, it's going to make it very difficult to convince the
Yes.
Social Security Administration of that.
Yes, and even with it,
Yeah.
sometimes that makes it a little difficult because when a hearing reaches the point of a administrative law judge, or even at the field office levels before that, they like things they can quantify. Just makes it
Right.
easier for them.
Right.
This test showed this. This person had, again, the manual labor had two lumbar fusions, and now he's having pain management because he's still struggling. It's easier to quantify. It's
Right.
harder to quantify. This person complains of hearing voices or
Right.
extreme
Or panic
anxiety or
attacks.
panic
Yeah.
attacks, or
Right.
even though they're certainly just as real, it's harder to necessarily substantiate. And that's where the treatment has to, and it really does help if the treating source is on board.
And in this arena, what's considered a permanent disability? What meets the definition of a permanent disability?
I don't know that there's one um there's one thing that would meet it. I think it depends on the condition and conditions. In other words, I think permanent isn't necessarily what we would think of in the outside world as permanent. Meaning, for Social Security purposes, if I meet the listings or I'm disabled today, it's permanent in so much as they have the opportunity to re-review it. And in fact, there's cases that are called cessation cases. They're cases where they try to terminate benefits after somebody's been on because they don't feel that it's any longer a condition that would be disabling. So I don't know in Social Security world if there really is such a thing as permanent. But it in a lot of cases, you could tell by the nature of the disorder, it's permanent because if I meet it now, I'm
Right.
probably not getting better.
It's
There are
permanent until it's not permanent.
right, exactly. But there's some conditions, for example, younger people with a mental health condition probably are going to be reviewed
Yeah.
periodically. They're going to
Right.
be sent forms because there's certainly a chance that maybe their conditions improved.
Therapy or medications may
Right.
change that versus someone
Absolutely.
who's got a fused spine, it's fused.
Right.
Right.
And I would also say to you that there's certainly I don't know the exact percentages, but there's certainly a percentage of people who are on disability who go off it, who do what's called a trial work period. They try and then they find something that they're doing and they go off benefits. So not everyone. So that when we talk about permanency, even from the claimant standpoint, they might think at the time it's somewhat permanent, but they've improved so that
Right.
they go off. And that's obviously the goal for everybody. Most people who meet with me about disability, not most people, I'd say almost 100% do not want to be meeting with me about disability. They would
Right.
much rather be working. There's a very, very, very small percentage of people who are content being on disability. It's a lifestyle change. It's their self-esteem is affected. A lot of times it's accompanied by depression, because it's a tremendous lifestyle issue.
So this is a last resort for a lot of people. It's not something they're
Oh,
choosing to be looking to do.
right, and to keep in mind, e everyone seems to know somebody who knows somebody who they don't believe is really disabled.
Right.
But keep in mind, to go on disability when it could take a year to 2 years to get disability and to maybe get paid a fraction of what you were potentially earning, people aren't generally doing that unless
Right.
they really have to.
Right. And if someone's coming to you and saying, "Look, Paul, I don't have any other options here. I have to look at this. This is something that I'm out of choices at this point." What kind of documentation are they going to need to ultimately provide you to help make a claim? I think we discussed that medical records certainly is going to be a big piece of it, but are there other things that they're going to ultimately have to provide to you to make an analysis for them?
Well, really, it's the medical, and it's going to be the medical is going to really depend on the type of condition. That's something you learn from experience. So I know when I'm looking at somebody who has a back impairment, let's say, I know what I need to be looking for. I know that a bulging disc isn't necessarily going to be the same thing as somebody who's had, like I said, a failed fusion.
Right.
I know what's going to be important. I'm kind of putting everything together, based upon age, based upon work experience, and based upon condition, and making that determination oftentimes on the fly, because usually I'm not seeing the records before I decide whether I'm taking a case. So
Right.
I'm assessing their credibility. I'm assessing the nature of their problems, and I'm also assessing how they would testify if it got that far. There's some people that you just do from instinct. You just say, you know what, this person's credible, and
Right.
I just think that it's going to it's going to pass the smell test. And,
Right.
and I think as long as there's any medical documentation to support it, it's we go forward because Pete, the way we get paid in a Social Security case is strictly a contingency. Social Security mandates what we can charge. So we're only getting paid if a claimant wins. Um, so at this
And
stage,
yeah, and that was one of the questions I had later on, but since you bring it up, um, you get paid from Social Security. It's not like that this person's coming to you and saying, "Hey, I'm paying you a retainer or doing X, Y, or Z." When you get paid if you're successful, and you get paid directly from Social Security
cor-
if you are successful.
correct. Social Security pays us directly It's strictly they mandate, and they have to actually approve our fee.
Right.
So um, every once in a while, there could be more than one attorney. So I've represented people where they've had one attorney and they've dropped that attorney, or the attorney decided not to pursue it. If there's more than one, the at whatever level there's a decision made that's favorable, they have to decide how the attorney fee would be split up. So, but it's strictly a contingency, and there's never a fee if they don't win.
Gotcha. And I think you alluded to this earlier in the episode, but is someone able to earn an income while collecting SSD or SSI, and is there a limit to what they can earn?
Yeah, you know what? That's a tricky question. The answer is yes. But the answer is it's twofold. You can earn up to a certain amount while you're on disability. That amount is currently, I think it's about $14,000 while you're on disability. However, that doesn't mean you're going to get disability while you're earning a certain amount. I'd like to clarify that.
Yeah.
So I have the burden of demonstrating that that person can't perform what's called SGA, substantial gainful activity. If that person's working 3 shifts of, let's even say, 15 hours, 5 hours each, 3 days a week, and they have to show up Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for those shifts, and let's say it's still below what the maximum they can earn is, I have to show why are they capable of working 3 5-hour shifts those 3 given days, but they can't work more than that.
Right.
So they might have been able to work that once they're getting the benefits, but I have to now show why are they still entitled to benefits? Why can't they work more? Now, as a comparison, if they're earning the same amount of money, but they're doing it from home with total flexibility. So they're earning, let's just say for argument's sake, $300 or $250 a week, but they're doing it at home, and they have the flexibility if they suffer, let's say, with back pain or migraine headaches. They have the flexibility of saying, well, you know what? If I don't feel good on Tuesday or Wednesday, I could take off.
Right.
And Thursday I could work, and then Friday I take off. And then that type of situation is a little bit easier to illustrate why that person couldn't necessarily have the regularity to work at gainful employment.
So
So
it really comes down to the uniqueness of each person's situation.
yes, and I would say if they're working in a structured environment, a certain number of hours each week, even though it's below what's called SGA, substantial gainful activity, income-wise, it's more difficult to get benefits because you got to show why couldn't you do it
Right.
in that environment with a little bit, instead of 5 hours a day, 6 hours a day, because a little
Right.
more challenging.
It gives them ammunition to chip away at why there isn't more capacity there.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
So I know that there's part of the SSD process for applying. There's something called the interview process. Could you explain what that is? And are there things, the SSD interview process and exam, and are there things people should or shouldn't be doing in going through these steps? To walk through that a little bit.
Sure. The interview, or the initial application. A lot of times now it's done online, simply because the field offices, a lot of them still aren't open full time.
Okay.
So a lot of people and we help people apply initially if they want us to. Really, there's not. They just have to be as thorough in providing as much information as possible regarding their background, and it really is information gathering. Along the way, Social Security will send you as well, potentially, to what's called IMAs, independent medical. They call them IMAs instead of IMEs, which are exams by certain specialists. They're usually not favorable. It's usually something where most people that I've represented have described it as they're just not thorough. They're just not usually very helpful for purposes. But the ultimately the ultimate determination by, say, an ALJ, they recognize that these have limited value.
Okay.
So really, I would say the one thing that I would tell a claimant from the beginning when they're applying for benefits is to recognize that the ultimate goal is work preclusivity. We're trying to show that any limitation you're mentioning, how it would affect your ability to perform work. So that's the ultimate goal is when you're applying for disability, you're saying I'm precluded from working. So you're trying to link any of these problems to how they affect a work-related function.
So you want to be describing impairments in that context as much as possible to show how something that might not seem like an impairment when you're sitting on the couch is definitely an impairment as it comes to gainful employment.
Absolutely, and really one of the biggies for Social Security is for your example, any limitations you might have with your hands and the use of your hands bilaterally, because most jobs would require to use your hands, in some function.
Yeah,
So it isn't so significant that you can't lift as much as it is you can't. Your dexterity is affected because there's a
right,
lot of jobs you don't have to lift,
right,
but there's basically no jobs that you can't use your hands bilaterally and you can still do.
right. Absolutely, that makes sense. Um, so I think you mentioned this earlier that the process is not a quick one. It's usually a year to year and a half. Is that a fair
Yeah,
assessment of what you tell people?
yeah, if I can break it down a little bit more, you apply initially. If you're denied, that's usually within a 3 to 4 month period. You would request reconsideration. If you're denied again, that's another 3 months. Then that's where the longest wait becomes. You then have a hearing, which is about 6 to 9 months after that. So it
Okay,
really depends on where we're successful in getting someone benefits. If they're successful before the hearing, it's going to be a shorter process. If they're successful at the hearing level, that takes the longest. Then after that's the appeals council and federal court, and that really drags it on even further. But most cases end at the hearing level.
and I think if someone's considering this though, that they should be mentally preparing themselves that they've got a year or more
Yeah.
to get this resolved. If it's done faster, great, but
Uh,
you should
uh,
be prepared for that.
That's exactly right, Pete. I stress to people that when you're hope for the best and plan for the worst, hope that it gets resolved before plan that it's going to be a year, year and a half.
Gotcha. And are there common reasons that you've seen why claims are denied? Or is it just really so unique to each individual
Well,
situation?
both. In that the most common reason is a lack of medical evidence. I mean, unfortunately, that's the most common. When I say both, yet there's cases that I have all the time that I think are going to be difficult ones, and we end up being successful. And then there's some that I think should be winning, and they don't. Um, so as much as you'd like to believe it's as exact a science as you can make it, sometimes there's applications that result in quick. In fact, I would say there's applications that we've been successful early in the process that I never would have dreamed we would have, and
Right.
so you don't really know for sure.
But probably it sounds like the most important thing to do is get it started. And
Absolutely. I tell people you have nothing to lose. Get it started because of the delays. If you go back to work, if you decide you're not going to pursue it any further, so be it. You don't. But and the other thing that I think is very important is if you apply and you go back to work, don't withdraw it. Let it play itself out because you might have what's called an unsuccessful work attempt, which
right.
is, you know, a
You
month or
tried to get
two,
back, yeah.
and you don't want to. Oh, I withdrew my application. I'm starting over again.
Right. Right. You're just resetting the clock.
Yes, exactly.
Now, if someone has gotten Social Security disability and they're 60 years old or whatever it might be, will they continue to get it after they turn 65?
Well, it merges. It merges
Okay.
with retirement. You get the higher amount, which is usually going to be the when you reach, and it might be full retirement age. Um, It could be 66, could be 60, whatever age that is, you'll get the higher of what you would have been your either retirement amount or your disability amount. Usually it's going to be your disability amount.
And if someone is looking to apply for Social Security disability, but they're currently getting workers' comp or veterans benefits or anything like that, how does that play into the calculation?
Okay, there's an offset for workers' compensation benefits. So it's a complicated, I think it's a little bit too long to go into here, but it's basically there's an offset while you're receiving workers' compensation as against Social Security. So um, it depends on how much you were earning before you can. So for some people, there might not even be any Social Security benefits available because your workers' compensation is covering it. But usually there's some benefits. In some cases, there's quite a bit of benefits still available.
Okay.
So, but there is an offset. And the standards are different for getting it than
Okay.
workers' compensation.
Well, and you mentioned earlier that, people don't apply for Social Security disability unless they have to because all the reasons we described, but also because it's a fraction of what they're making. How is a disability payment determined? What's the calculation that goes into what someone might get?
It's based on your work history. So obviously, for some people, it's a larger percentage of what they've earned because their earnings were such that they didn't. So it's capped. So, for example, as we've discussed in previous episodes, say as a sports fan, Michael Jordan if he was applying for Social Security disability, he's still capped at a certain amount, say $4,200, if he was in that realm, or 4,400. So realistically, his disability claim is going to be a much smaller fraction than
Of what
myself or you,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Of what we earned. So that's why but it's always going to be significantly less. So for somebody to wait it out and to apply, they really have to be in some significant distress.
Gotcha. And if they do get disability, are payments made monthly? How did they get paid for
Payments
that?
are made monthly. I believe I haven't. I don't know that it needs to be direct deposited, but I can't remember the last person who received Social Security who wasn't getting it direct deposited. So I'd say the great majority, if it doesn't need to be, are being given it direct deposited. And you're also entitled to medical insurance or Medicare 2 years post disability. So
Okay.
regardless of your age, you're entitled 2 years after after your disability date. So
So you don't have to wait till you're 65 for that.
correct,
Okay.
correct, which is obviously a huge benefit for people with the cost of medical insurance.
Yeah, for sure. And if someone's spouse was on disability and they died, do any of those benefits, go to the surviving spouse?
That's a good. You have to still be this. It's called surviving spouses widows benefits. You have to be between 50 and 64 and independently found to be disabled to get your spouse's income.
So the remaining spouse also has to be disabled
Between the ages of 50 and
50 and
64
65 or
to
64.
collect under their other, or well, now excuse me, now it's 66, 50 to 66, and still they can collect under their spouse's benefit amount.
Gotcha. And Paul, as we wrap this up here, I know in our initial episode you had given an example of a client you helped recently with a disability claim, and maybe you could just retell that story, just because I
Sure.
think it would help people understand what this can mean.
Sure. That I believe the one I was speaking of was a younger gentleman who had pretty significant mental health issues. And I was dealing quite a bit with his mother, also his father, but more his mother. And we ended up being successful at the hearing. And what it meant for the family was obviously You had parents who were just extremely concerned about the well-being of their child going forward. They actually were, when I say older, their son was only 24 and the parents were maybe in their 50s. So they weren't, and they were concerned what's going to happen when we're not around. And I think it I think it was a just result. And I was just thrilled because they were nice people and they were concerned parents. I was thrilled for them and I was, for their son. So
Yeah, it has to be a
it,
relief to know
it's
that
just,
somebody like that.
and it's just a tremendously gratifying, really gratifying feeling.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, I want to thank you for sharing your insights on Social Security disability in this episode, and we discuss long-term disability at the next episode. So, thank you again, and I will be talking to you very soon.
Great. Thank you, Pete.
Thanks.
Always my pleasure.